On-farm and backyard composting is a great way to dive into organic waste management with the benefits of creating nutrient-rich soil amendments and healthy ecosystems. In this episode, I'm talking to Neil Kaufman of Dallas College about composting. We discuss the frequently asked questions of home garden composting to market garden scale to industrial composting for wholesale distribution. So no matter if you're just getting started and have lots of questions, or if your compost piles have gone anaerobic, Neil has tips to keep your compost from just becoming a hot mess to a landfill diverting garden supplement powerhouse. And now, here's Neil.
Thanks, Nick. I'm Neil Kaufman, and I am the Assistant Director of Sustainability for Urban Agriculture at Dallas College. I've been with Dallas College for a little over a year and a half. And before that, I was the Sustainability Manager at UT Austin within housing and dining. So doing all kinds of food procurement, campus gardens, farmers markets kind of thing, and kind of catch-all for sustainability. And before that, I was studying wildlife biology. I was a botanist for a little bit. I was doing all kinds of things that involved plants and people and education and horticulture and anything that I was just interested in that moment I was doing, and ultimately led me here.
And that's the problem with having somebody like you here is like, what do we talk about? Like how do we best maximize your time sitting here? And so we had talked about several things to talk about: ornamental landscaping, ornamentals for added value sales. I'm sure we could talk about beneficial insects and that kind of thing, and on and on. But I think we've narrowed it down to composting because you've been doing composting workshops throughout Dallas and helping some people there. And I think that's going to have the most bang for your buck. All to say, we'll probably have you back. So yeah. I'm excited about that. But you're up here. We're working on a project together for the college. And, like I said, why I thought we had you. Let's talk about composting. Clay, completely, like this is my first time I've ever heard about composting since you are the today's expert. And, a lot of people, I think, when they first get into gardening, and let's think about this from a home gardening perspective, they think about composting. I'm sure they're thinking about just having a pail, perhaps somewhere in the kitchen, and they're worried about flies and the smell and all that kind of thing. So if you were to advise on somebody just about where to even begin to think about what would you have them do?
So the first thing I have somebody do when they're saying I want to get into composting and they have like zero understanding of what it is, usually they do something. They'll look at these kitchen top composters and think of that as an actual tool for composting.
When we're talking about those super little tiny
it's
ones.
Just a collection, right? It's just a collection bucket, and I'm like, just don't pay money for that. Just put it in one of those grocery bags and put it in your freezer. And they're like, oh. Yeah, of course. And of course now 3/4 of my freezer is food scraps. But aside from that, I would suggest once you figure out how to stage your food scraps, and then figure out what is it that you're trying to do? Is it divert food waste from the landfill? Is it produce a finished product that you can use in your garden? Is it so what is it that you're trying to do? And then what is it that you have to offer? Is it land? Is it lack of land? Do you have a budget? No budget? Because you can do composting in any of those permutations. It's just a matter of figuring that out first.
I like that you brought that up because it's like anything else that we do, either in farming or gardening or just in life in general, is there's no one singular point of distinction for so many things. And just the fact that compost could divert, or it could feed, or it could add soil. I like having the goal in mind, just like I would want you to have a goal in mind of, hey, we're going to grow tomatoes. Why are we growing tomatoes? Who's it for? So I like very much that distinction first off.
Yeah. If someone wants to grow tomatoes for I don't know, this would be an inefficient use of growing, of achieving this. But if say pollinators, right? Okay, well you're not actually doing it to harvest the fruit or to sell the fruit or whatever. And so same thing with composting. A lot of times people will read these blogs about, okay, here's what not to put in your compost pile. Well, if you're, when I lived in Austin, at my house, I never harvested that compost. So I felt comfortable putting stuff into my compost pile that I would never put into my compost pile if I was growing potatoes.
This is a dirty little secret. Is this what we're trying to hide from everybody? So
exactly.
Let's talk about what you should not put in compost, because that's I know I've seen the same blogs, the same cute little graphs.
Yeah.
No avocados, no meats, whatever.
Yeah. Well, so so first of all, the list is you're always going to find, it's easier to find lists that are very restrictive. But in reality, you can get away with a lot more than than people think they can get away with. Which I think a lot of that actually goes, because composting is kind of a microcosm of so much in horticulture, or it's just a piece of it that represents the whole. Because there's a dogma around it, right? But in reality, it's actually not that hard. People overthink it, and then when they overthink it,
don't say.
Right. And so I used to overthink it too, and then I went did some research and some work in Ecuador, and I this was after teaching a few rounds of master composting classes in San Marcos. I went down in Ecuador into this like village, right? And I lived in a treehouse for a few months, and someone was doing composting, and I was like, I felt weird. I was like, they're not doing it right. And I was like, you're supposed to have, if you're going to be doing compost tea, you should have a bubbler. You should be doing this and that. And then it dawned on me, before I thought to speak it, they don't have electricity, and they're effective in what they're doing. So who am I?
And you're living in a treehouse, so
and I'm living in a tree. Yeah, exactly. So
like how you just casually throw that out.
Oh yeah, it was a good time.
Who hasn't?
I only got like 5 parasites, but it was funny because it was like it was a realization for me that if someone is effective at what they're doing, even if there's like no grounding in science, sometimes, and maybe there is, but like whatever. If they're effective at what they're doing, and they have their own method, then like let them do what they're doing, and maybe keep doing what they're doing.
Especially if they're not trying to put it on you all the time.
Yeah, exactly. And so same thing in composting is like, okay, if you're, look, I get it. There is some risk of danger if you're putting human waste, right, involving that and trying to grow potatoes, and you're not doing it very safely. Okay, that's where I'll usually cut in, and when somebody's asking me questions about that, and say, okay, you're going to try that stuff, like you need to read up a lot more on it before diving into it. But otherwise, it's hard to really mess that up.
And as far as besides just the kitchen scraps, we get into the whole brown side of things, where newspapers or cardboard or packaging or things like that. And I've seen, there's always purists on either side. Not saying anybody's right or wrong, but I see it come down to, well, what's the ink that's being used for these packages? How you feel about that?
I'm a radical. What's the right term for it? I'm a radical, like, throw it all in. Some people will say, well, the chlorine in the water will affect the microbes, and I'm sure it does. But you can't say it doesn't produce a finished product. It doesn't produce a healthy compost at the end.
And doing something is much better than doing nothing at all.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, and it also kind of goes back to, what is your end goal? If your end goal is to divert waste, then by all means throw it all in. If your end goal is to produce a really specific boutique compost, and you're a PhD microbiologist and you know exactly what's in your compost and whatever, then great. Have your own system, and you're trying to get a whole like array of microbes that perhaps a certain ink would affect. Although I would be hard pressed to find those types of feedstocks that would have that great of an influence on the microbes. Ink is negligible. So much of what we put in is negligible because so much of it is non-negligible, right? It's the carbons, it's the nitrogens.
Well, it goes down to the first thing you said, in that, look, are we trying to divert food scrap, or are we trying to make the very best possible compost humankind has ever seen, or are we going to fall somewhere in the happy middle of that?
Yeah, and oftentimes you can still produce some of the world's best compost and break a lot of those rules.
Right.
And so composting has an enormous amount of chaos incorporated into it. If you look at the actual science, like the publications around composting, it is the most inconclusive corner of horticulture that science has to offer, because
it's endless variables and endless climates and endless conditions.
It is the least replicable end of horticulture, and so to be able to say compost tea is efficacious, compost tea is not efficacious, well, I don't really know, because it's so dependent on the compost itself. And how do you define compost in a laboratory setting? It's almost impossible, because so few of these microbes are actually defined in science or articulated. So So yeah, there's just so much chaos that you kind of have to just follow the basic principles and go with that.
Well, this comes down to one of our top questions that we had at Bootstrap Farm is, well, where do I get my soil or my compost locally? The closest you can get without having to ship something very heavy and oftentimes a little wet, i.e. more weight, because that's grown in your conditions. It's going to save you a bunch of money. And at the end of the day, I can't imagine shipping a truckload of compost from Vermont to Southern California is going to yield that much better product to justify. Look at the industry we're in. Let's do things as ethically possible for the good of the planet. But you're going to ship compost on an 18-wheeler across the country. Like, I've always had an issue with that.
It also goes back to, I think we find a lot of this in agriculture and horticulture is diminishing returns. Yeah, you can have the fanciest lights, or you can have the fanciest whatever, but like the cost and the feedback you get is not going to be linearly, and so you're going to get diminishing returns with compost. Now, I mean, so you may be able to brag about having like a world record, crop or whatever it may be, but the cost is going to be enormous.
Right. And I guess that with anything else in farming, there's multiple different ways to compost. Why don't we cover some of the more popular ones, and then let's narrow down on the one that you specifically like, and you can tell us your reasons for liking that, and then we can get comments on why you're wrong.
Yeah. Oh, I love those. Well, so I think so. First of all, I'll just say that one thing that I love about doing composting workshops, whether it's these hour-long ones or 20-hour-long ones, knowing that my goal is to provide confidence for people that, hey, this is a lot easier than you think. All the rules that you're going to be reading about online, because the more you read about it online, the more you realize how complicated it is. But that's the opposite. It's actually really simple. And so you just follow these principles. So I go over the principles and then say, now make mistakes and just do it. Do it and make mistakes and recalibrate.
You make mistakes because of the variables that we mentioned.
Yeah, and because but as long as just like what is that adage about the best fertilizer in a garden is footsteps? That observation is more important than any other kind of input that you can have in a garden or in a farm. And so same thing in composting. And just knowing what to look for, what not to look for. Those are the things that we learn in a workshop. But
could it also be argued that, hey, leave this thing alone for a few days and just let it do its thing, and then mess with it, or then check it out?
Yeah, if you baby a compost pile, it's not gonna like it.
Right.
So some of the composting techniques, it kind of runs the gamut between, let's say. And I work in higher education, so like there's the dorm room composting, whether by accident or on purpose.
So pizza crust compost.
Refrigerator composting, and there's that side of it. Then you have like ranch or big farm composting, and everything in between. So the in between that you see the most is like the backyard composting, the normal backyard composting that most people they'll see, okay, a tumbler is what I need to get to make compost. So they'll spend $300 or $400 on a tumbler and say, okay, now what?
And a tumbler sits on a stand and you crank it in some mechanical device and it turns the compost.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's a big old.
Or you can do it on the ground and kind of roll a barrel around.
Yeah, a big old barrel kind of thing, and those are useful for retaining moisture and for agitating your compost over. But they're not a magic device for producing a finished product. So one of my favorite thing is those ads of those tumblers that have a guy on his knees, like showing you what the finished product looked like, and he very obviously like got this, he got some like stuff from Home Depot, right, and like had it coming out of there, and maybe even spray painted it. It's beautiful color.
You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, I mean this stuff is like screened compost coming out of this tumbler, and that stuff is I've seen tumblers work really well. I've seen people do it right. But I've also seen it being like, well, why, if I throw my food scraps in there, why is it not producing compost?
Well, it comes down to the inputs. Like if somebody's taking the time to chop stuff up real fine, throw it in the tumbler, versus, hey, here's a whole tree branch, it's going to come out much different.
Yeah, exactly. So tumblers, that's one strategy. But usually I talk to, you know, a homeowner, let's say, and say, okay, well, if you have kids that you don't want jumping around, because I would have been that kid jumping around in the compost. That's how I first got into compost.
You're so filthy, dude.
I got into compost by literally getting into compost. Or if it's dogs, right? So like in Austin, my poodle would dig his snout into that compost and find all the gross stuff. So if you got to build a barrier out, but even building stuff out isn't going to. I mean, a compost happens naturally, as we like to say, it just happens. So you don't need. Turns out you don't need any money for it, and that's like the best. People like to hear that, but it may be worth some investment, some infrastructure if you're trying to keep things out. So maybe it's a structure to kind of build out your walls or to keep things out. So yeah, you have, generally speaking, we like the lasagna method, right? That's layering things. That's a good way to start. And then, so also keeping in mind your time is another factor. So you'll read online too, these like 12-day compost. Well, I don't want to apply anything that only took 12 days.
Right.
That's gross. I don't want like half rotting tomatoes in my garden bed.
One of the rule of thumbs I always heard is like, if you can't tell what the compost came from, you're getting there.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. Now you're going to have some food scraps like avocado pits. You're going to still see, and that's fine. Another way to think about it is like, if you were to take that item and then put it on your kitchen counter, how gross would it be after another few days? So if it's going to like get real gross, so like an avocado rind, you're going to see that after a few months. But if it's going to get real gross, then after a few days on the counter, then it's not stable yet. So make sure you have that time. So that's anywhere at minimum 6 weeks to 6 months to a year.
What's your thought on both watering and then taking the temperature, and then like how does all that lead to the manipulation and the turning of the compost?
That really goes back into how much somebody wants to spend, how much investment they want to spend on it. I will say compost thermometers are a pretty good investment for the medium to high level composter. They're like $15 on Amazon. You can get a pretty cheap compost thermometer. But those are great for knowing where your compost is at in the cycle. Your compost is going to naturally produce heat. It's going to get some heat from the ambient temperature. It's going to get a little bit heat if it's in the sun, but that's not where we want our heat to be coming from mostly. It's coming from the bacteria breaking apart the sugars into CO2, and that's an exothermic reaction.
And that's happening deep within the core of the pile.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually a good point. It's happening deep within the core. And so you're not going to get that if your compost pile is 2 inches deep. You're going to get that if your compost pile is at least 3 feet deep.
Which says that if you're composting at home, small scale, that's going to take some time to build up any meaningful amount.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's going to take time, or have your carbon materials on stock so that you can build that up and have a good first batch.
What's your ideal carbon to green ratio?
So the textbook answer to that is your browns to greens is 3 to 1. So that's like, let's say 3 buckets of your leaves, dry leaves, to your 1 bucket of, maybe fresh cut grass, your lawn clippings, or your food scraps. But I think it's important to have that as like your minimum ratio. You should have a lot more browns than you have your greens. So maybe that's just like a whole lot of just basically a mulch pile, and then you work in your greens.
Well, and I would imagine that it's real easy to overload with leaves in the fall.
Mm-hmm.
I could see that being an issue.
Yeah. And so what a lot of folks will do is they'll have a separate pile of just browns, or your mulch pile. They'll get those mulch drops, which
in itself is semi-composting under its own weight.
Oh yeah. So everything has its own carbon to nitrogen ratio. Every chip of mulch has nitrogen in there too, and so you're going to have decomposition happening within that. So it's just a matter of increasing your nitrogen side of that carbon to nitrogen ratio, and you can do that. But it's good to go from on a sliding scale from your heavy carbon to work your way to a heavy nitrogen.
I'm going to freely admit that I got oddly attached to my composting worms. And so I would find myself like almost saving a little bit more of the vegetables than I normally would just for them, and like taking the time to blend it up or grate it up just so they could have it. So that's like, to me, making compost at the super fine level, again, for the purpose. I wasn't doing worms to grow the compost. I was feeding my worms, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I know we haven't really got into vermicomposting just yet, but it does go to say, with this extra amount of browns that we just mentioned with the leaves and the buildup in the fall, like I always felt like you're almost eating more vegetables. Like, I do think it adjusts your diet a little bit. So you're like, well, I got to compost, I got to do this. Like, and it does change your lifestyle to some degree.
Well, I mean, especially if you're sounds like a worm daddy. You're a worm daddy, and so if you
I've been called worse.
So if you got a whole zoo of worms, right? And you know, when I was in college, I dabbled in worms. That's how one of the ways I got into it. And I had a whole shed of worms with the composting program down there. I ended up running that, and so, you know, if I needed food in a pinch, and worms are needy critters, and I can't just give them the scraps that were coming off of our kitchens. I mean, because I couldn't control what was coming out of the kitchens. So, and I wasn't going to just like buy a, watermelon and just give them the whole watermelon. That'd be wasteful. So I would buy a watermelon, eat the watermelon, give them the rind. But so, to your extent, that would improve my diet as well as improving their diet. Yeah.
It's crazy what we do.
Yeah.
Go to college dabbling in worms. Super fun guy.
Oh yeah, that's how I got into floral arrangement. I say, I dabbled in floral design too in college.
Can you give an idea for folks like we're talking about gardening in very small farm levels? I want to skip over like the middle-sized farm just for a second. Can you describe what a gigantic commercial composting with the big turner machines kind of looks like, so people have an idea of, okay, I've got my 3 pallets in the corner of the yard, and I'm playing around, and then we're going to talk about what a market gardener can do. But let's skip to the big commercial. We're cranking out pallets a day for like Home Depot distribution.
Yeah. So, large commercial scale composting. So composting, those facilities are in Texas are listed and regulated similarly as a landfill. It's like a different class of landfill. So there's a lot of regulations that go into it. There's a lot of costs. What's funny is a lot of people will say, "Wait, you're charging me to collect my food scraps, and you're charging me to get the compost."
Real laborious.
It's
and
like
super expensive.
I mean, like, there's a reson why it costs the way it does. Is and also, if you think, and we talked about it before, if you think you can do it cheaper, then go for it. Yeah. Good luck. But so there's a lot of labor, and there's a lot of randomness to it, right? There's but it's a very intensive process. So the way it works generally, there's a few different methods. There's windrow methods, you'll see often, and then there's static piles. At least in Texas, I don't see a whole lot of anaerobic composting. I think in the north, they do a little bit more with anaerobic composting.
That's kind of ones in the pits that they're watering down and
or they use a big old tarp to do that. And I'm sure there's a reason. I'm sure there's a very good reason why Texas doesn't do a whole lot of that. But
we have the space primarily.
Yeah, I'm sure it's space. And
like the one I went to, just for context, is it would, and they're also centered around agriculture that produces a lot of waste. So the one I went to was composted cotton burrs. So we're talking the Panhandle, right next to feedlots. So they're taking the manure from the feedlots. They're taking, an unimaginable amount of cotton burrs, which is like whenever they harvest cotton, it's the plant material that's left over. And they're combining these in those long windrows, like you said. So just imagine, a large field with just rows and rows, 15, 16 foot tall sometimes, and several 100 yards long of this material that's all piled up. And then there's the one I saw was a machine that basically was 2 towers on wheels with this paddle in the middle that would just drive itself down the middle and paddle that stuff.
Yeah, so those are the Scarab machines, or I think that's the brand for that tractor. And they spray those down. They turn it every for a few cycles. But yeah, you add to that that windrow, and you keep adding to it, and then
it's super hot because of the manure. I mean, it's cooking, man.
Oh yeah, they really really cook. But then you have static piles, which those I've seen those get up to like 50 feet plus, and those can get a little scary because those get very 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 hot, because temperature in a compost pile is related to the height or the volume of the pile. So when you get very very high, you get risk of compost fires, and those are very scary and all too common. But you also get pockets of anaerobia in those, and where you don't get but those will be cooking for 9+ months or even longer. So they just mound them up, and then they pull it off after a while and let it cure for a little bit.
And to go back to what you were talking about, the cost, why is compost so expensive? We have to get it in large quantities to this facility. We have to have some type of conveyor system to take it up to the top and dump it on top. Then we have to have very large bulldozers to turn it around and to reload it into the trucks. That's then going to go to a bagging machine, and then a palletizer, forklift back onto a semi-truck with bags to take it back out. I mean, it's all this stuff. It's heavy, super industrial equipment, and it's expensive, man.
And
the land.
The other piece to it that adds a lot of expense is the contamination, especially if you're getting. So yeah, industrial waste is one thing, agricultural waste is one thing. Those are easy. That's composters. It's like that's not an issue. It's residential waste, it's retail waste that adds. I mean, they can charge a premium for that because folks want to be able to do the right thing to divert their waste.
But they don't, so it has to be separated.
It has to be separated. So you have some companies that do pre-separation, and they sort it as it's coming in. And so because of that, they don't accept compostable plastics. A lot of composters don't accept those anymore.
And I don't know if you're aware of this about the public, but oftentimes they get stuff wrong. And so they're probably just composting all the wrong stuff or trying to recycle all the wrong stuff. I'm trying to do the right thing in a good faith and, pat on the back, but it clogs up the system in such a degree. We have to have these pre-sorters.
Yeah, pre-sorters. And then, if I ran a composting empire, I would be doing it probably on the back end, just because it's that way you get to capture more things and then you can pull things out. The problem with that is you get, it mechanically breaks down, and so it can be a little bit more difficult. So I've seen it on both ends. But you still get things like, that stuff turns into confetti, right? And then you have a big old mess on your hands. So,
well, and it's still a commodities market in that sometimes it's not cost effective to even recycle, which is part of the problem that we're in. Mm-hmm. If we're having to take our recyclables, put them on a truck, get them on a train, load them up onto a cargo ship, float it across the world to get turned into something else for us to buy and rinse and repeat, it's unfortunately sometimes not the best use of funds.
Yeah. And so commercially it's if you're getting $35 or $40 a yard, at least that's what it was a few years ago, or what is it, $4 a bag, something like that. I mean, for a lot of like very, the kind of backyard gardeners who are thinking about, or don't necessarily think much about how to properly garden or like what goes into it, they're going to just see the Miracle Grows and go with the pelletized fertilizer and whatever. And I should just pay maybe a premium for the Miracle Grow and avoid the dirty stuff. So I mean, there's kind of the application of composting, and so that's something in my workshops I talk a lot about, is a very important thing ecologically in terms of horticulture and best value and for optimizing the return on your horticultural spaces.
Sometimes paying a premium actually isn't, because I mean there is occasionally sometimes a load of agricultural byproduct will come in and it's been sprayed, and they'll have hot pockets of glyphosate or something like that in there that then in fact messes with the compost for the end user, no matter how long it's cooked. Yeah. It happens, and it's super unfortunate, but it's something you have to look out for, which again is all the more reason to be doing it on site, your own stuff.
I saw recently, I used to joke, like people would ask, what happens if my pile goes anaerobic, this backyard composting. And I would say, well, look, if you provide optimal conditions, the good guys will win, the good bacteria as in. And so just turn your pile, add more browns, that kind of thing. As long as you don't put gasoline in your compost pile, it's salvageable. And I used to joke about that until more recently. I actually saw that. Someone called me up and they're like, why does my compost smell like that? I swear, I'm pretty sure they mixed in 50-50 asphalt and compost and called it compost.
Excellent.
And it smelled like rubber. And it was like, and they were using it. And like, nothing's growing. Well, yeah, this is the best weed killer you can you can have.
So we explain very kindergarten grade level when something goes anaerobic. Exactly what does that mean?
So anaerobic means without oxygen. When something goes anaerobic, especially when we're not intending for it to go anaerobic, if we're intending it to go anaerobic, there's a set of conditions that we need to be able to kind of provide. But if we're not intending that, that's not ideal. It's producing phytotoxins, meaning poisons for plants. It's off-gassing nitrogen. So the nitrogen that we want is turning into ammonia, and it's going into the atmosphere. And you can oftentimes smell that. And when you're smelling is attached to the nitrogen attached to molecules when you want that in a solution form or solid form inside your compost. There's a number of reasons why we don't like that. And so those phytotoxins, again, that's going to be poisonous for our more sensitive plants.
So now we got that covered. Let's now bridge the gap and go market garden scale. Let's say you're anywhere from an acre to 5 acres. You're processing on site at your own wash pack, and you're perhaps cutting off the tops of lettuce or carrot tops or all the things that we have to do to make the vegetables presentable for the market. There's a lot of food waste there. We're not talking about a single pallet or tumbler at your house. We're not talking about a big tractor and conveyor belts. What would you recommend people do at that level? So
I would say it depends on a few things. The investment, like how much they want to spend on it in terms of money and time. And there may be curiosity level as another piece to that. Is
there a financial windfall here in that maybe do you feel like you could ever produce enough compost on site? Of course, with all the variables, there's a lot to be said here to 100% make it worth it. Or is it like, look, we have to do something with this anyway. And yeah, maybe we'll get a few $100s worth of compost a year.
It really depends on the market around them. If they're like, the only farmer, and within, in 10, 15 mile radius is nothing but like strip malls. And I'm just trying to think of the most ridiculous example of like, well, in that case, and nobody will want to buy your finished product.
Right.
It's possible to get to a point where, you can offset some of the costs, for sure, by producing your own compost. But you may be able to say, get it to where your neighbor farmers will want to buy some of that off of you. But yeah, I think looking at what are your inputs and what are your goals and outputs, and what do you need that you don't currently have that you can supplement with that compost. Usually it's, okay, I have this surplus. I have these stems or I have these leaves that are just like, I don't want that to go to waste. That's carbon and nitrogen you spent money on by way of fertilizer and time and water. You can recapture that. You can recycle that, and you should be recycling that back into your farm. That could be done through static composting, or even cold composting if it's not a whole lot. If you really want to get into some more active stuff, like let's say you're small enough farm where you don't have even a tractor, you just have sub-acre kind of thing, and you have just
the old pitchfork and shovel.
The old pitchfork and shovel. Something that, the guys at No Till did a great video on this, is the aerated static composting. And then we did this at the Four Down skate park. So those guys talked about wanting to buy this $300,000 in-vessel composter. And they're like, Neil, what do you think about that? And I was like, that sounds like a fun toy for $300,000. If you have that, God bless you. If you, that sounds like grant money and all that kinds of stuff and fundraising. But I can show up next weekend with $200 in PVC tubing and a bouncy house blower, and we can get this done. And I did. And so we've been composting for the most part ever since. And and now they just worked out a contract with Turn Composting to really scale that up. But what that does is allows you to do high volume inputs without needing heavy machinery, because you don't have to turn your compost 5 times within every 8 days or so.
And so basically what you're doing is you're laying the pipework, perforated pipework on the ground, piling on top, and you're blowing air into it.
Yeah, so that air runs for about 30 seconds every few minutes, and that's just enough to get that pile cooking, and then you
it's kind of like on a fire, just
bellows,
billowing the air in there.
Exactly, yeah, and just getting those microbes, so it prevents that anaerobic pockets from the inside. But it also dries out your compost, and so it does need supplemental irrigation. And then you layer that, and then you pile on a finished layer compost on top of that. Then you flip it over to let it cure, and then you can stack a new set on top of that. So that kind of composting is relatively. I mean, it is. Imagine pitchforking however much of that, but you only have to do that once or twice,
right?
As opposed to, let's say, a windrow, where that's a lot more pitchforking without a tractor. And so that's something where you get high yields, you get high processing, and it's a relatively quick turnaround. So as minimal as 6 weeks, you get it close to a finished product and then curing. I will say it may not be your highest quality compost that you can get, but if you don't need the highest quality, maybe you can supplement it with some more fertilizers or whatever. You just need the
volume to add top dressing or something.
Exactly. It's top dressing. It's a soil amendment, but it's not the
constant hole filling that you always get with erosion and runoff.
Yeah, that's a good way to do it. I think that's fits the molds for a lot of those type of market gardeners that aren't doing that don't have big old tractors. But even if you did, I mean, heck, if I had a tractor while I was doing it, I'd be using it.
For sure. And you don't have to have a huge tractor either, just something with a little bucket on there, or maybe even a box blade just to knock it around and turn it. A bit ago you mentioned cold composting. Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, that's a lot of people do cold composting by accident. If you forget composting for long enough, whether it be irrigation, not adding your feedstocks, or not turning, it's going to turn cold after a week or 2 or 3. And so, and that's okay. It's just, if the pile never gets hot enough, you're going to not be able to pasteurize the pathogens that are in there, especially if you're adding your meats and dairies. It's not going to pasteurize your weed seeds, which may not be that big of a deal. If you're composting on site, the weeds are already going to be there.
Right.
Which, I don't know, I have a hot take on that too, which is that people say, don't compost your weeds. Look, these are herbaceous weeds anyway. It's from my own yard. Like, what am I going to do? Have a worse weeds problem than I already have? Like, get out of here. So I get it if you're transporting feedstocks around town, and like you're transporting dandelions that are like just gone to seed, and you're not getting your temperatures. Yeah, that's annoying. Don't do that. But for the most part, that's fine. So cold composting, a little bit higher risk. You don't get it's a lot slower of a product, but it's a lazier product too. I mean, you can just throw it there. Think about leaf mold as an MOULD. You just throw your pile of leaves into a corner, and because everything has its own carbon to nitrogen ratio, you get composting going on. You check back in a year, and hey, look at that. There's some nice compost at the bottom of that.
On the clinics, what are some, give me a couple of examples of somebody came in that were so worried about X, Y, or Z, and it prevented them from actually starting? Like, what are the things that hold people up from starting, other than, I feel like with gardening and farming in general, there's a lot of analysis paralysis, a lot of fear of messing something up, so we never start. What do you do to encourage people, like, just do something here?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some of it is, what do I need to buy to get started? And I'll say, you don't have to buy anything.
Right.
It's already started. Composting happens in your soil. Composting happens sometimes in your refrigerator. So composting is happening. It's just a matter of, are you going to facilitate it in a way that's productive for your own good or not? And so that's a big thing, is what do I need to buy? And again, the answer is nothing. sometimes people insist on it. Which brand of tumbler should I buy? Which brand of, whatever. And okay, fine.
It's all coming from the same factory.
Yeah, it's all coming from the same factory, and it's all going to be, a matter of hundreds of dollars. So, okay, let's sit down and go through what you can buy. But otherwise, it's knowing that you're not going to get a product tomorrow. There's not one day you have unfinished product and the next day you have finished product. Kind of let it go for a little bit. And actually that's sort of what makes worm composting more difficult. And a lot of other, it's difficult for a lot of other reasons too, but worm composting requires just enough attention that you can't forget about it or else your worms are going to croak. You can't have cold composting. It is cold composting, but you can't just like a year later check up on them. They're all going to be dead. So you have to look at it, at least every 2 weeks or so. But it was just enough time to completely forget about it. So that's where it gets a little scary.
Right. Does anybody ever have the hang up of, well, this is going to take 2 minutes a day times a whole year, and I'm going to get like this much compost, 5 gallons worth of compost. Do I even need to mess with it? I could go down to Home Depot and spend $6 and make that much instantly without all this hassle.
Yeah, I get that. Well, so that's what I was doing in a way. When I had a house in Austin, and I was composting. I knew I was never going to produce the amount of compost that I needed to garden. So I would just go get my favorite compost down at the Home Depot and or in bulk from the same place, same producer. And so that would get me what I needed to do gardening, but I would still doing composting because I just enjoyed doing it.
That's right.
I think
you're still diverting away from the landfill.
Still diverting and still doing all the things. But so I see this throughout horticulture, throughout agriculture, oftentimes with like indoor plants, right? Someone will say, my grandparents, for example, they'd say, I don't know how often I need to water my Sansevieria, so every Sunday I go around and water all my plants. Okay, well that's not really the best way to water your plants, right. But you know what?
But everybody's guilty of it.
Everyone's guilty, and like I get it. Like I don't know of a better. I can't sit down with my grandfather and say, "Grandpa, look, this plant's going to require more water, more attention." That plant, and I shouldn't say that because he's doing a killer job at it. Like whatever he's doing great. So when it comes to things like composting, there is a little bit of ritual that we have that helps. Even if it's not necessarily like optimal for the textbook, solution for composting. So if it is, okay, every Sunday you go take your frozen bags of food scraps and you go out and you kind of do your ritual with the composting. And actually that is good. That is a good way to do it. And to work through it. And so that's how I kind of work with a lot of folks because they're looking for those solutions. Like, how do I like achieve this in a way that I need a recipe? And oftentimes there is no exact recipe for a lot of these kinds of things in agriculture.
Look, it's like anything else in growing. A lot of it is just a gut check. Does it feel right to throw a little bit of sand on there? Does it feel right to not throw a block of cheese on there? Preached on here, this podcast before, just the range of, look, you can have the very, very, very best plant ever and the whole system around it. And that's what people in glass greenhouses that are 30 acres and only grow one type of tomato do. It's completely optimized just for that one thing that they already have contracts on. Or you have a gardener that only deals with orchids and that's their whole life. Or you have a market gardener or a home gardener that's doing mixed crops and a little bit of love for everything. You're never going to optimize it and giving yourself the permission to just move forward and get stuff done. And this plant may not be the highest yield that you could, but it's still enough to make the effort worth it. Composting sounds like it's the exact same thing.
Yeah. I mean, because especially with most types of composting, what's the risk? I mean, yeah, if you wanted to dive into like large scale composting, there's going to be some risk with that. That's manageable if you give it the right amount of time. But otherwise, it's like, shoot, what do you have to lose?
Not gonna hurt
pile
anything.
It all into a corner and then get out what you want to put in. And you can get out a lot if you put in a little bit more. But the bang for the buck is probably a really impressive like yield on on the investment there. And I think that's something else is that goes into a lot of horticulture or agriculture is intuition. there's a sense of intuition, and composting is a big part of that. We know what good compost. You don't have to teach what good composting smells like, a finished product. You just inherently know as a human, okay, that's premature compost, that's unfinished product. Finished compost smells like earth, and we all know what that smells like.
Is there any considerations, like we have obviously a wide range of listeners, so the southernmost states versus the northernmost states, is there any adjustments that you would make from climate zone to climate zone?
There's going to be rainfall, right? That's going to be something in the where you don't get a whole lot of precipitation. You're going to have to irrigate your compost. I mean, okay, you don't have to irrigate your compost, but you're not going to get a finished product within a time that you're maybe looking for.
But you also can't flood this thing with just constant rainwater.
Well, yeah. So if you're in the Pacific Northwest, oftentimes they'll tarp their compost because it's too much water and it'll go anaerobic. But which is a funny thought here in Texas to think like, oh yeah, sure. I mean, you would have to really like lay on the water for it to get that wet from a hose. But otherwise, like that would never happen with the rain here. So irrigation.
No, this year maybe. I guess.
Well, if you're even then, like if you're in a flood zone, right, and the water's pooling up, but the otherwise, you may want to look at like pH of the soil or pH of your finished product in the composting. Your feedstocks may be affecting that. But I mean, honestly, like really good compost is going to be a buffer, a pH buffer. And so it's going to be able to absorb a lot of those fluctuations and be able to provide for you what you need anyway. And then you can always like fine tune it with your organic fertilizers at the end anyway.
What's it look like whenever it's freezing weather? You've got snow on the ground for 3 or 4 months. Is there any considerations you do for that?
Temperatures. Yeah, that's another thing. I mean, so like you said before, composting inherently produces its own heat. But there is a temperature at which it'll shut down. If it gets that kind of cold, your composting is going to slow down and it's going to get into a cold composting. But that's an okay place to be too, right? It's just going to be a little bit dormant. You can cover it and preserve that heat inside. But I mean, those microbes are just going dormant, and they can get reactivated with when it warms up again.
Along the similar, we're going to take a crazy left turn here, and this will be the last thing. But I've seen videos on Instagram especially, and I'm sure there's a bunch on YouTube, that you're basically building a thermal battery of compost, and the byproduct that you're searching for is not only the compost, but the heat that it generates to, similar to your blower that's blowing air in it, maybe can we blow the heat out of it to like heat a greenhouse in the wintertime? And I guess my issue with that is, how consistent is that, and how much mass are you going to have? And I know that's just a little askew of the conversation that we're having here, but I know people are thinking about it, so let's talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's like fun to play around with. I think you're right. Consistency is a big thing because every day that temperature is going to change.
Still have a heater backup is what we're saying.
Oh yeah, for sure. Don't rely on that. But it's another, inherently, I always kind of like, okay, sure. Like if someone can find a way to make that work for them, God bless them. And I'm sure people do.
But it's doubtful it's step-by-step repeatable for somebody else, especially in a different zone.
It's not replicable. And
it's kind of like the A word, isn't it? Aquaponics word.
Well, like a lot of things in agriculture is, okay, that works for that farmer, and they found a way to market it in a way that's like, okay, I want to replicate what they're doing. I want to bring it to scale, and it's not scalable and it's not actually replicable because
it's for sure not plug and play.
Oh, it is not in no way. But
you're going to screw it up 10 times before you even barely get it right.
Yeah, I get it. The physics works, the theory is there, but like, is it worth the amount of effort to make it something that you want to depend upon? But I get it. If you're just trying to demonstrate this principle, and really the principle shouldn't be you can heat your greenhouse with composting. The principle should be composting is a thermodynamic process. And here's how we can demonstrate that. That's how I look at it.
Right.
And then again, there's a lot.
Are we farming heat or are we farming vegetables? And where's our time / infrastructure money best spent? Yeah,
exactly. And look, I specialize in showcasing all the little bits of.
You're in the academic field. You have to show this stuff.
When we show all the little pieces of it, but we make clear that this is, you know, just to demonstrate this kind of function or this kind of principle. You know, if it was, you know, like someone had told me a while back, is like, there's a reason why you don't see 80-acre aquaponic operations.
Right.
Yeah, but because it's, you know, there's a scalability issue, and but
is it acres or gallons at that point?
Right.
You know, we better shut this down before we get canceled. If somebody wants to, like, if you're within a 4-hour drive of Dallas and you want to go to one of your composting classes, where can people see that schedule?
So really what I'll say is reach out to me, and I don't have anything like that's scheduled. You know, but I'd love to do, you know, I'll do site visits. I'd love to come visit people's farms and help them out. I am a government employee. I'll just do it. Like I love doing it. And this is what I do. So I'm happy to do one-on-one stuff, and I'm also happy to put on a workshop if someone wants to host me. My fee is $0.00.
Oh my goodness, we got to change that.
You
got travel expenses, man.
Yeah, I mean, look, I got my plug-in hybrid that takes me there. So, but no, this is stuff I tell people, like, shoot, if it wasn't ridiculous for me to pay to do it, I'd be paying for me to get to yap about composting. I just enjoy it so much.
I get it. Well, thanks for driving up here and getting with us today, and we're going to get back to work on your project off camera. And hey, Neil, thanks for everything. I'm glad our circles overlapped.
Yeah, likewise. And thank you for everything you do as Nick Burton, but also thank you, Bootstrap Farmer, for all you'll do. I've been a fanboy of yours since I first came across your stuff in 2016. So anyway, I'm looking forward to continuing this work.
All right, cool. Well, everybody, if you have any questions, put them in the link below. If Neil doesn't catch them, I'll ask them and I'll put them down there. But yeah, we're out.